everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the music of World War II and how composers portrayed the war in their music. Similar to my World War I video, I'm going to be introducing you all to some of the most famous war pieces, as well as spotlighting a few of the lesser known ones, because those are always fun. And along the way, we'll also include some biographical details on what the composers were doing during the war. Basically, it'll be a timeline of war music immediately before, during, and after the war, and that way we'll be able to look at those broader shifts in how the war changed the genre of war music. Content warning, as we are going to be addressing topics like the Holocaust and the atomic bombings, but as usual, there won't be anything excessively graphic. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy, and here is the war music of World War II. So in order to understand the music of World War II, we first need to go back to World War I. World War I, broadly speaking, had made war music much more sad. This is because people had gone into the war rather naively, thinking that it was going to be all fun and games. Then they got to the battlefield, and it was an absolute slaughter. Because by that time, modern weaponry had become much more lethal than it had in the past. World War I was much more deadly than any other war people had ever seen, and it made people realize that death was a very real part of war. This shift in attitude was reflected in the music of World War I, whereas before, war music had tended to be rather lighthearted and even entertaining. Think Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. Now, war music tended to be much slower and sadder, and often served to mourn the dead. This trend continued throughout the interwar years of the 1920s and 30s, as many composers continued to write war music in a belated response to World War I. There was also a growing fear that a new war would soon break out, as there was actually quite a lot of political turmoil in the 20s and 30s. For example, in Germany, people felt like other countries were blaming them for World War I and making them pay heavy reparations, and there was a growing desire for revenge against those other countries. Hitler, beginning his rise to power in 1919, exploited the people's discontent to help build his political platform and became the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. There was also a lot of territorial aggression, as Germany, Italy, and Japan all wanted to invade some other country. And yes, those three would end up forming the Axis powers in World War II. So as you can see, there was quite a lot of fear that there would be another world war. And this thought was especially horrifying for the people who had lived through the First World War. The composer Ralph Vaughan Williams was one of those people. In World War I, he had served as an ambulance driver, and his Pastoral Symphony, which we talked about last time, was inspired by his experiences in the war. During the interwar years, he wrote a cantata called Dona, Nobis, Pacem, which is a Latin phrase for grant us peace, and the work is a plea for peace. Vaughan Williams shows the destructive nature of war and the loss and suffering that it causes people. For the lyrics or text, Vaughan Williams uses passages from the Bible, as well as the Roman Catholic Mass, and some poems by Walt Whitman, who was an American Civil War poet. These kinds of texts were pretty common for the war music of the time, but Vaughan Williams also quotes a political speech, "The Angel of Death has been abroad throughout the land," which was a protest against the Crimean War in the 1850s. And we'll see that in the war music of World War II and the years following, composers would continue to use a wider variety of texts. During World War II, Vaughan Williams was well into his 60s and was too old to fight, but he remained active in civilian war work, helping refugees, organizing benefit concerts, and serving on the boards of various arts organizations. So if the music of World War I was generally sad and protested against the war, you might expect the music of World War II to be very similar. However, that was actually not the case. At least at the beginning of World War II, composers tended to focus on the heroic and triumphant side of war. At first glance, this doesn't make a lot of sense. World War I had taught people how deadly modern warfare could be. Why were composers still so optimistic? And with the Axis powers advancing across Europe, seemingly unopposed, why were the Allied composers so confident that they would win? The key here is that the optimism of World War II was very different from the optimism of World War I. In World War I, people had no experience experience of what modern warfare was really like. Their optimism came from a place of naivety, of thinking that war was just fun and games. In World War II, however, because people had had that experience with death on such a large scale, they were frankly more used to the idea of death. World War II had an even higher death toll than World War I, and yes, those deaths were still a tragedy, but they came as less of a shock. And so the music of World War II didn't fixate on death in the same way that the music of World War I certainly did. Another reason was that people were optimistic because they had to be. They had to believe that they would win. For the Allies, giving in to Hitler would have meant living under German occupation at best, and at worst, it would have meant total annihilation. It's very well known that Hitler viewed some groups of people as subhuman and unworthy of life. In the Soviet Union, German forces had already invaded several hundred miles into Soviet territory, killing or enslaving millions of civilians, before they were finally turned around at the Battle of Stalingrad, which we will talk about in a minute. The Allies had to keep fighting even as the casualties piled higher because there was no other alternative. One of the pieces that has this intensely optimistic outlook is Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. This piece is often known as the Leningrad Symphony because of the role that it played during the siege of Leningrad. The whole story of the siege and the Seventh Symphony is absolutely fascinating, but as a quick summary, in 1941, German forces surrounded the Soviet city of Leningrad in order to intentionally starve the inhabitants to death. Over the course of the 3-year siege, 1.5 million people died of starvation, cold, disease, and bombings. However, seemingly against all odds, there were still a handful of survivors. A handful meaning around 700,000. The common denominator in a lot of these cases was morale. These people survived because they remained hopeful. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, among many other things, was something that could give people that sense of hope. Think of what it would have been like to be in Leningrad during the siege, surrounded by more death than life, yet knowing that someone out there in the same situation as you was creating something beautiful. The Nazis thought that Soviet people were less than human, and yet here was a Soviet composer writing a symphony, an ultimate act of defiance. Shostakovich himself wanted to contribute to the war in ways that he thought were more substantial, and he did spend some time as a rooftop firefighter, the stories of which were milked for propaganda, but the government decided that he was more useful as a composer, writing music that would boost people's morale. The Seventh Symphony is at times incredibly violent and speaks directly to the suffering that people faced. However, it ends on a note of triumph, which is not only a message of hope to the people of Leningrad that they would make it through the siege, but also an act of defiance to everyone who had wanted them dead, both Hitler and their own leader, Joseph Stalin. See, the music of Soviet composers holds another layer of complexity because of the role of the Stalin regime. During World War II, Soviet people were living under the oppression of not one, but two dictators. Hitler had killed millions of people in his concentration camps, and Stalin had also killed millions of people, both in his collective farms and in his mass purges of, quote, traitors, which was basically anyone who disagreed with him. However, while Soviet composers were allowed to openly criticize Hitler, they were definitely not allowed to criticize Stalin. So composers would often say that anything violent or evil-sounding in their pieces was meant to represent Hitler, when really it was also a disguised portrait of Stalin. Case in point is Prokofiev's 7th Piano Sonata, which along with the 6th and 8th sonatas are often called the War Sonatas because they were written during World War II. The 7th Sonata has moments of incredible violence, like this stomping motif from the first movement. The second movement has this sort of broken lyricism. It has a sense of nostalgia and wanting to go back to when things were better, but then coming face to face with the overwhelming power of the regime. For the third movement, if you don't know the backstory of the piece, it's actually a lot of fun both to listen to and to play. It's got that 7/8 rhythm that's super catchy and just keeps rolling along, but if we add Hitler and Stalin back into the equation, things get a lot more interesting. The ending, for example, it seems triumphant. We're hammering out all these big chords at double forte at some ungodly tempo, but we still have all this dissonance that makes the triumph seem a little less genuine. Is this really a victory, or is it Hitler rolling into Moscow and crushing everything in his path? Is it Stalin beating you over the head and saying that life is getting better, comrades? Is it a hope for the eventual defeat of tyranny in whatever form it may take? That's an open question. Most Soviet composers didn't say exactly what they were writing about, because if they had, they probably would have been carted off by the secret police and never heard from again. And two, the way that these pieces could be openly interpreted allowed them to resonate with a wider audience. People could hear whatever they wanted or needed to hear. In the case of the 7th Sonata, it was often nicknamed the Stalingrad Sonata, not because Prokofiev himself called it that, but because it was written right around the time of the Battle of Stalingrad, and that's what people associated it with. If you're unfamiliar with the Battle of Stalingrad, basically it was a turning point in World War II, where the German invasion of the Soviet Union was finally halted, and the Soviets finally began to win on the Eastern Front. However, this victory came with an immense cost, with 1 million casualties on the Soviet side. And so in this context, you can imagine how people would have heard the 7th Sonata as the light at the end of the tunnel, a representation of both the victory at Stalingrad and the hope that they would now win the war. So this kind of ambiguity in music was extremely important. Not only could it get the composer out of trouble, but it also served to fulfill the emotional needs of the listener, whatever those may be. So German music in World War II is a complicated story. In the Allied countries, some German music was banned, as you might expect. However, German music was still so central to the concert hall repertoire that trying to get rid of all of it was nearly impossible, not to mention financially stupid. Case in point is Beethoven, who was German, but was viewed in practically all countries as a universal symbol of freedom, one that could transcend national boundaries. It also happens that the opening motif of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony actually has the same rhythm as the Morse code for the letter V, which during the war was often used by the Allies as a symbol for victory. And so Beethoven 5 became a sort of victory code for the Allies and was played all over their radio broadcasts. There's also the whole issue of German music within Germany. For example, the role that Hitler himself played in regulating the kind of music that could be written. Also, the Nazis actually had a Jewish orchestra, meaning they had Jewish musicians who would play Jewish music. It was kept for propaganda reasons and is really quite bizarre. But each of those topics is its own rabbit hole. Actually, all of these topics could be its own full-length video, so if you do want to hear more about any one of these, let me know in the comments. One of the most famous pieces of World War II is the Quartet to the End of Time, written by Olivier Messiaen in 1941. Messiaen had served as a nurse in the French military before he was captured and taken to a German prisoner of war camp. At the prison camp, the German guards decided that Messiaen was harmless. They also enjoyed music, and so they let Messiaen keep his collection of sheet music and even gave him some manuscript paper so that he could compose. I'm not pointing this out to say that the conditions at the camp were all rosy and good, or to belittle the experiences of the war, but I think it's important to remember these moments of compassion that existed alongside the bloodshed. As with Beethoven 5 being a universal symbol of freedom, music could transcend the wartime animosity between nations and connect people on a much more personal level. At the prison camp, Messiaen met a clarinetist, a violinist, and a cellist, and wrote the Quartet for the End of Time for piano, clarinet, violin, and cello. The title references a passage from the Book of Revelation in which an angel comes down to earth and says that, quote, "There should be time no longer." Messiaen wanted to abolish our understanding of time and present us with a sense of eternity. The fifth movement, for example, is marked infinitely slow. If you're excited about the apocalyptic leanings of this piece, just wait until we get to the post-war pieces, because it gets even better. Better as in more bleak and existential. So, thinking back to the earlier pieces of the war, like Shostakovich's 7th Symphony and Prokofiev's 7th Sonata, both of them were written by Allied composers at a time when the Allied forces seemed to be losing, and yet they both end optimistically, at least to some degree. In the later years of the war, the tide had turned in favor of the Allies, and yet the music of Allied composers actually got much darker. Yes, some composers continued to express their faith in a now near certain victory. Prokofiev's 5th Symphony is a good example of this. However, many other composers were much more pessimistic, or realistic, if you like. They saw that war is terrible even if you win. Shostakovich's 8th Symphony, for example, is much darker than his 7th. Of the pieces associated with World War II, many of the most famous ones were actually written after the war had ended. As people began to focus on mourning and commemorating the dead, composers began writing music that would serve this need, effectively continuing the lament tradition from World War I. An example of this is Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, which we talked about last time. In addition, there were two topics that post-war composers tended to focus on, and those were the Holocaust and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Henryck Gorecki's 3rd Symphony, also known as the Symphony of Sorrowful Songs, isn't about the Holocaust specifically, rather it focuses on the more universal theme of the bonds between a mother and child, and it is a lament of how those bonds can be broken. The lyrics in the second movement were actually written during the Holocaust by an 18-year-old prisoner of war on her prison cell wall. Gorecki said that those words had stood out to him because everyone else was writing about hatred and suffering and wanting revenge, and here was this kid who was not thinking of herself but of her mother, as she is the one who will experience true despair. Another famous piece of the Holocaust is Different Trains, written by the Jewish composer Steve Reich in 1988. During World War II, Reich was a kid living in the US, and as his parents were divorced, he spent a lot of time shuttling back and forth between his parents' homes in Los Angeles and New York. At the time, those train rides had seemed fun and exhilarating. It wasn't until much later that he realized the implications of being Jewish and being in the US during the Holocaust. Had he been in Europe, he likely would have been riding on a very different train to a very different place, as in a concentration camp. Before we talk about the actual music, I should preface this by saying that this was a time of great experimentation in classical music, where composers tried to push past the traditional boundaries and redefine what music could be. In their music, they often incorporated new technologies as well as extended techniques, which is playing an instrument in a way that it wasn't originally intended, as in plucking the strings in a piano or bowing on the other side of the bridge on a stringed instrument. This is basically to say some of these more modern pieces do get a little weird and might not be what you're used to hearing. Different Trains, for example, is written for a traditional string quartet, but also recorded tape. Reich uses the sounds of train whistles, air raid sirens, and snippets of interviews from Holocaust survivors. The clips of spoken word are especially interesting in the way that they interact with the music. When dealing with words in music, usually they'll be sung to a melody. Sometimes they're also spoken over background music. In Different Trains, however, the rhythms and melodic contours of the words are actually used to generate the musical motifs. For example, in one of the interviews, someone is talking about trains and they say, "From Chicago to New York." And if you use a little bit of imagination, you can start to hear the music within the words. From Chicago to New York. From Chicago to New York. And from that snippet, you get a musical motif that you can build your composition around.
From Chicago. Filled up the sky. It was smoking.
Different Trains is one of those pieces that allows us to appreciate just how difficult it is to write music about historical events. On the one hand, Reich is preserving history by using testimonies from actual survivors in their own words and voices. However, he only used short extracts from the original interviews, meaning he often lifted phrases out of their original context and repurposed them for the narrative that he wanted to create. It's also important to remember that Reich didn't experience the Holocaust firsthand, and so his depiction of the event is still somewhat of an imaginative interpretation. I'm not trying to say that Reich shouldn't have written the piece or that it's not valuable. I think it's very valuable in the fact that it reminds us of the atrocities that took place and also tells the stories of the survivors. However, in the process of remembering and communicating those experiences, we often alter the very thing that we are trying to preserve. Different Trains can't be taken as a factual, historical account of the Holocaust, but it still plays an important role in keeping its memory alive, which is a paradox that is very difficult to overcome. The music written about Hiroshima and Nagasaki often draws on similar themes and musical techniques as the works of the Holocaust. Composers often used extended techniques and new technology. One of the most famous Hiroshima pieces is Krzysztof Penderecki's Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima, which wasn't actually inspired by the bombings. Initially, Penderecki was just experimenting with the different effects that you could get out of string instruments, and the title of the piece was 8:37, like John Cage's 4:33, which just tells you that the piece is 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It was only after Penderecki heard an actual performance of his own piece that he realized the emotional effect that it could have on its listeners, and it was after that he dedicated the piece to the victims of Hiroshima and changed the title, which I think was absolutely the right decision. The sounds that he manages to create are extremely disturbing. It sounds almost electronic, but it's just a string orchestra. What they're doing is playing tone clusters, which is a chord made up of adjacent notes. So it's like if you went up to the piano and went like this, which you do sometimes. Case in point is Prokofiev's Sixth Sonata, another one of the war sonatas. The Threnody also uses a lot of quarter tones, which is an interval that's even smaller than the semitone or half step, like if you had a note halfway between C and C sharp, for example. With all of these experimental techniques, the music of World War II is often much more graphic in its depiction of war. Yes, during World War I, some composers would use percussion to represent gunfire, but on the whole, war music was much more abstract. There were certain musical tropes that acted as stand-ins for the concepts of war, like trumpets and fast scale passages representing excitement, and slower lyrical themes representing mourning. By World War II, composers had all these new sounds and effects, and they could actually reproduce the sounds of war at face value, more or less. Like in Different Trains, we had the sounds of air raid sirens. In Threnody, you have this gray mass of buzzing static. You could say that the war music of World War II was much more graphic and much more literal. Another common theme that came out of the music of World War II was depictions of the apocalypse more generally, not just specific to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Depictions of the apocalypse have been around for a long time, however, they became extremely common in the years following World War II. With Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, people realized that they now had the capability to destroy themselves entirely. For a lot of the war music that we've looked at so far, whenever composers needed lyrics or words, they would often turn to war poetry. The piece Torkila by Niels Benson is actually based on a classic apocalyptic novel, On the Beach by Neville Shute, in which a nuclear World War III has wiped out the entire northern hemisphere, and we watch the lives of the people in Australia as the radioactive cloud slowly slowly but surely makes its way towards them. I unfortunately do not have a copy of Torquila, as the nearest copy is in a library in Denmark, but if you're interested in bleak apocalyptic stuff, go check out the book. It's really good. An apocalyptic piece that I do have a recording of is Karel Huse's Apotheosis of This Earth, written in 1970. According to Huse, the work was inspired by a number of contemporary events, including the nuclear arms race, as well as everyday killings, war, hunger, extermination of fauna, huge forest fires, and critical contamination of the whole environment. Like many of the apocalyptic works of this time, Huse uses quite a lot of experimental techniques. In the first movement, we have this really unsettling quarter tone melody that sounds almost computer-generated, but it's just a clarinet. The second movement is actually supposed to depict the Earth breaking apart, possibly from a radioactive explosion. The glissandos are a really nice touch. The third movement represents the aftermath of destruction, when there really isn't much left to be said. The chorus stumbles through a few broken words before coming together to say, "This beautiful Earth." In essence, the apotheosis is a warning. Huse wanted to present us with a scenario that was so horrifying that we would think twice about making it a reality. And so, that is the war music of World War II. If I had to trace the progression of war music in an oversimplified way, I would say that before World War I, it was, haha, look at war, it's so fun and heroic. Then during World War I, it was, oh, war is deadly. People actually die in war. In the interwar years, it was, please don't let there be another war. And when the Second World War did appear, it was, we will win, we have to win. And after World War II, it was just, we're all gonna die, and it's gonna be our own fault. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how war music has developed and how it was shaped by the wars of the last century. Other than that, that is about it for this video. Let me know if you liked this slightly shorter format down in the comments. Also, if there's any topics in music history or performance that you want me to cover, please feel free to comment those as well. I'm thinking I'm going to do something about Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique and that whole symphonic acid trope. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something interesting. Thank you for being here, and I will see you all next time. Bye.